Good morning. We're in Honors Junior English, and we're working now with the Images poets, and more particularly this term that we're now going to hear over and over again, Modernist poetry. Modernist poetry and the Modernist poets. We're talking now with Ezra Pound's essay, If You Don'ts, on page 719, and we want to begin by making some quick observations about what makes a poem imagist, or a poet imagist. As you concentrated on the 5 elements, what for you were the most important? Kennedy, start us off. How about it? What's at least one thing that makes a modernist poem a modernist poem?
You said use only exact words and don't put in other extra things.
Language is going to be, I don't know, what's a proper verb here, Mr. McGee? For language, it's going to be cut away, pared down. We're going to get to the fundamental essentials. We're going to, what Strunk and White said in his classical essay, avoid needless words. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I forget what verbose means, but it sounds like the right word.
Verbose is going to be almost like the opposite of modernist. So it's thank you for that word. So in other words, there's going to be a lack of liquidity, a lack of lots and lots of language.
Like writer workshops, where the rule is show, don't tell, I guess.
Let's write that one down. That's a really important one. Thank you, Mr. McAfee. Show, don't tell. This is a fundamental modernist edict. Show, don't tell. When you look at what Ezra Pound has to say, notice he concentrates in 2 areas, language and rhythm and rhyme on 720. I want to start with this whole thing of language, though. Let's go there first. What is his major point about the poetry of modernity in regards to language? How about it, Ermintrout? What is it that he says here on page 720 under language? We've already mentioned to some degree this, but go ahead, amplify.
Get right to your point.
Get to it.
Don't use unnecessary words.
Get to it. Don't worry about how long the poem is. Do you remember a sophomore seeing Red Wheelbarrow for the first time? One of our first instincts was to say, this can't be a poem because it's not long enough. Right? I mean, come on. There's hardly 20 words in the whole poem. You got to be kidding me, right? Keep going. What else about language do we want to say?
Don't mix the abstract with the concrete.
We want to be concrete or abstract. Which one, if we're modernist? Very concrete. We want to write that down. We want to be very concrete. Sometimes this kind of poetry is, we've been able to say it this way, it's like taking a photograph, an image with words. Ergo, image is poetry. So the impression of an image on the senses is going to be foundational to understanding these kinds of poems and appreciating these kinds of poems. All right, what about rhythm and rhyme? Remember, the modernists are directly going to contradict the poetry of Longfellow. Tell me not in mournful numbers, life is but an empty dream, na 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 na, right? So foundationally, they're going to have problems with any kind of poetry that looks like this in terms of rhyme, in terms of rhythm. You want to qualify anything that's being said here on that count? What is it that's being said about rhyme rhythm? How about it, Dorn? What's his point here?
That there's no certain rhyme.
Don't worry about rhyme. Don't worry about it. And in fact, when we look at this poetry, we're going to see almost an abhorrence of rhyme. They will often see rhyming as roses are red, violets are blue, sugar is sweet, and so are you. The minute you start rhyming, you have reduced whatever you're writing to doggerel for these kinds of poets. They loathe the idea that poetry has to be lyric in its nature to the degree that it's repetitive.
And he compares it to music, so.
He does. In what way do you see a comparison to music?
I guess like notes.
A lot of the poets of this time period had backgrounds out of music as well as they were often linguists. So they studied languages, lots of different languages. They loved to translate poetry. Pound is a classic example. Translate poetry for him out of the Mandarin, out of the Chinese. And so they were hypercritical to making a science of poetics. Finally, they wanted to leave the reader shocked. I guess that's a good verb to use it that way. They wanted to leave the reader stunned. Maybe that's a better than shocked, because shocked kind of has a pejorative or negative implication. They wanted a reader to read the poem and go, what? So, on some level, when you read Wheelbarrow for the first time and went, what? You're going to be playing right into their hand. Right, that's exactly it. That's exactly it. In other words, they're going to challenge you to think about poetry in a whole new way. Now, let's be fair. Where are the antecedents to this kind of poetry from the studies that you've already engaged in? Where are the antecedents? Who are the poets that will immediately come to mind when we start thinking about these kinds of poets? Right away. Who are they that we already studied? Clearly, we've got to think of Emily Dickinson. We have to think of Emily Dickinson. She will have, of course, very much influenced this kind of thinking. Who else? Of course, Walt Whitman, right? Those two American poets are in many ways kind of the trapdoor to this kind of subterranean linguistic world of these poets. Let's take a look at Metro and Wheelbarrow. And this is just to say, these three poems, we could spend a few minutes, or obviously we could spend months with these poems. Let's start with In a Station of the Metro. The apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. How about it, Miss Costall? Let's work us through this poem. What kinds of elements make this poem modernist? Can you give us one?
The simplicity.
It is incredibly simple. What makes when you say simple, do you mean few number of words?
Not necessarily.
What do you mean by simple then?
The lack of superfluous vocabulary.
Right. There's not a lot of language contained in this. Keep going. What else makes this Miss Hodges, what makes this a work of modernity?
It doesn't rhyme.
There is no rhyming. Now, notice there is an inherent rhythm. The apparition of these faces in the crowd. There is a little bit of a sense of rhythm within that line, right? And crowd and bow have a sense of a rhyme that we would call slanted, right? But you can clearly tell this is not Pound's intent. What is his intent? Dare I ask it, what is the picture? We're playing a game of metaphor here. Notice, we don't have a simile at play here. There's no like or as going on here. We've definitely got metaphor going on. If you had to reduce this to a simple simile in simple language, what would it be? Do it real quickly at level 1 for yourself. What is it that he's talking about? He says, A is like B. What is A? What's the first line? Reduce it to your own words. Faces in a crowd at a train station where everyone is standing still, packed tightly close together, waiting to get into the tube or wherever, right? Okay, into the underground subway or a train or whatever, right? So they're all packed together. Nobody's moving, stuck together. The perspective is almost as if he's looking from a perspective up above, right? And he sees all of these people standing. What's the second line then? Those people are like what? How would you say the second part? What's his simile but not a simile? What is his metaphor but not even quite a metaphor? What is his second line? What is this about? Petals on a wet black bough. I'm sorry? Yeah. What is a bough?
I don't know.
Do we know? What is this word?
What's part of a boat?
A bough. Petals on a wet black bough. Oh, now all of a sudden, we've gone from, wow, this is a simple poem to, wait a minute, what is a bough? So maybe we're going to do a little search real quickly and see, do we have a dictionary that can tell us what a bough is? So that we know what we're talking about? To what is he referencing? It might make sense for us to kind of know what this is.
Tree branch.
Yeah, wait a minute. A tree branch. So now all of a sudden we're like, now we can go back, see how we can go back to our poem again, our notes, and we're writing now about the second line. People standing at a subway station, packed tightly close together. Maybe it's raining. If it's not a subway station, it's an outdoor station, so the rain is falling on them, so it's kind of shimmery, shiny,
Umbrella.
right? It's kind of raining. So what does the second line say? A wet black bow. Meaning what? What are a bunch of people standing in the train station like? Go ahead, read, say it out loud. They're kind of like what?
The petals are kind of like the crowd.
Yeah,
Droopy and sad. And
right, on a tree branch, and the wet is on, dropping onto the leaves,
Kind of wilting.
wilting. There it is. We use droopy, but wilting is obviously a bit more academic word. Let's write that one down. So in the end, what is his point about people at a metro? He says a lot without saying anything. What is he saying? What is the sense of this image? Is it like this? Yay! Yeah, you sense that there's a bit of a critique here. In the second line, what are the words that probably give you a sense that this is kind of like, yeah, right? You have interesting color images going on here, don't you? All right, let's look at the William Carlos Williams texts. It's fun that we saw this once before, and now we can come back to it to look at it more seriously. Let's take a look at this one, the red wheelbarrow. So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow raised with rainwater beside the white chickens. Now I must say, when this poem is published, immediate fights about, are you kidding me? A child could write this. Ergo, simplistic.
Kind of like modern art.
Modern art was happening at very close to the same time, right? Where many people would say about a work of modern art, any child with a bunch of crayons could do as well. What do you want to say about this one? What do you find, Ms. Gustalis, most interesting in terms of the grammar of this poem? What is missing?
There's no capital letters, no punctuation.
But there is a
period.
Period.
fascinating. Now, let's point out, these poets will work long and hard on these poems. So there's science always here, okay? They don't just throw this stuff on a page and then hand it out for people to read. They spend a lot of time working with it. Any ideas about why there is the de-emphasizing of capitalization? And other punctuation, for that matter. Why, do you think? Anybody want to take a stab at why? What do you think? Dorn, you going to take a stab at this one? Why?
Maybe because it's just trying to, because it's just like a simple
He
idea.
wants it to be simple. He wants it to be really simple. Ask questions like this. Where do you normally see a wheelbarrow? See? Outside, not inside normally. Where do you normally see a wheelbarrow in chickens? Ah, so we're talking rural more than urban, right? Right? What do you make of the opening line? Lots has been written on this very first line. So much depends upon.
The livelihood of the people.
Right, quite literally, Carver says, dude, we can just talk in economic theory. A lot depends upon the pieces of land where you find wheelbarrows and chickens. Because those can become representative of what? What happens on the piece of land. So we don't think about this when we go to the grocery store to buy our bread or any of our other necessities, correct? Most of the stuff that keeps us alive comes from a place where there are wheelbarrows and chickens. Right? So now all of a sudden, this isn't so simple a poem anymore. So much depends upon, injects into this poem a certain kind of voice that says, you ought to think about this. Think about what? Well, let's keep looking. Notice a red wheelbarrow, glazed with rainwater, so you can begin to kind of see, right, in your mind's eye, beside the white chickens. What is it that's so important about that, do you think? So much depends upon. What so much depends upon?
Society.
Society we could think of. Keep going. What else depends upon?
That's
Well-
what the wheelbarrow's full.
Where does Thoreau go? What does he say? He doesn't say I went to downtown Boston to live deliberately. What's he say? I went to the woods to live deliberately. Why? See, now all of a sudden we begin to ask ourselves distinctions between the urbane versus the rural. And of course, for those of us that live in small, kind of rural places, this poem has an even more interesting meaning to us, right? Is there really a point? This is just to say, yeah, this one's kind of fun. I've eaten the plums that were in the icebox in which you were probably saving for breakfast. Forgive me, they were delicious, so sweet, and so cold. What's fun about this poem?
He's trying to be sincere, but he's not sincere at all.
Who's he writing to?
Some
I'm not
person who
100%
really
believe this
wanted
poem's about
something.
Pete.
Wow, see, all of a sudden Costella says, you know what? It's interesting, but these poems start to mean something more than they just mean.
Conveniently in a high school.
Right. These poems have a second and even a third meaning. And all of a sudden, you can't help but begin to wonder, why is it plums? I mean, the poet could have chosen any number of food articles. Why is it plums? And all of a sudden, several of us go, seriously, Costalis? Come on. In the room, the women come and go.